My name is Audrey Woods. I'm the Assistant Dean of Enrollment Management at the Kline School of Law. We are so excited to have you tonight talking about careers in financial regulatory compliance. We have alumni, we have professionals in the field, and lots of great information to get to. First, we're going to start with a little introduction to the Virtual Career Office. This is exclusively for our online graduate students. So I'm going to ask Professor Jacobus and then Professor Lichty to give us a little information about that program for those of you who would like to learn more.
Thanks, Audrey. So I'm Laura Jacobus, and I know that we have Laurel Lichty on this Zoom as well. The Virtual Career Office is something that Laurel and I built together a couple of years ago. We both are lawyers and professors at Drexel and have pretty extensive careers in terms of a variety of legal skills and also assisting students.
And Laura and I created the Virtual Career Office like at the behest of Drexel, but the idea was really to have, similar to the goal of Drexel generally, have real practical information for the workforce, right? I mean, we all study in order to be able to learn applicable knowledge to be able to apply to the workforce, and the VCO is for that.
That's right. One of the most common things we hear from students is that they have concerns about whether the skills they currently have or the professions that they've been engaged in the past will actually lead them to a compliance job. So one of the main things we focus on is transferable skills, right? Every skill that you need for a compliance career is really a transferable skill that you likely learn somewhere else. And so we're really trying to help people take those skills and translate those into the compliance world. So what actually is the VCO? The VCO is a link within every online MLS class or LLM class. It actually goes to kind of a mini course. So the VCO looks like a mini Drexel course. It's actually a series of different modules, which Laurel and I built, and they are on topics that are career related, things like networking and resumes. They actually have readings and exercises to help you prepare yourself for your job search. We have, a variety of different resources in there to actually help people. And so what we ask students to do is drop in whenever they want. It's free. It's not like you have to pay for an additional course. They can click on the link, drop in at any time, complete all of the different modules that we actually have in there. And then once they've completed the modules, they get to pick one of us to work with, depending on location or background or whatever. And likely they would have had one of us for a course or two. And then we work with them on a more personal level to help them define their career goals, help with LinkedIn profiles, assist them with networking, interview skills, etc. In addition to that, we have some other things posted in the VCO. We hold Zoom sessions about, your branding, your brand potential, making your career documents actually work for you. In addition, we have a job board on the VCO. So we actually go out and actively pull jobs that we think would be good for various areas of focus within the MLS program. And then we just work to provide different tips for students and really give enough career information within that VCO that while students are in school, instead of after they graduate, they actually do some preparation to be able to find the job that they want. And so holding a panel like this is so critical for us to be able to get people who really are working in the field and can talk about their daily lives, and then to even be able to post this panel and other panels within the VCO as a resource for students. So it's just fabulous. So thank you to everyone who's here today.
All right, thank you. And here are this is the contact information of Professor Jacobus and Lichty if you have more questions. So next, I'm really pleased to introduce to you a current Master of Legal Studies student. She is one of our MLS ambassadors, we call her. So she is available to you to answer questions and share her experience as a student. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand it to Amanda. She's going to lead the panel for us. Thank you, Amanda.
Thank you, Audrey, and welcome guests and panelists, and thank you for joining our panel today on careers in financial regulatory compliance. As Audrey mentioned, my name is Amanda Tilley, and I will be your moderator this evening. and I am a student ambassador for the MLS program, of which I'm in my 3rd semester. I am a dual concentrator in cybersecurity and information privacy compliance and financial regulatory compliance, which might seem like an odd combination until I tell you that my day job is as an information security analyst for Ocean First Bank, which is a community bank in New Jersey. Now let's give our talented panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves and speak a bit about their background, education, and career path that led them to where they are today. So to begin, we will introduce Grace Valachi, who is a mentor of mine and also the Chief Risk Officer at Ocean First Bank. Grace?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here and to share what little I can impart to the group. So I started my career many years ago after graduating from the University of Delaware as a finance major. I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I recalled a professor mentioned that if that described you, you might be interested in being a bank examiner. I happened upon an advertisement for job openings at the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, and started my career there. And I loved it. It was great. I learned all about different aspects of banking, learned about the law, banking law, learned about analyzing things, and just really got a lot out of that and enjoyed it very much. But I reached a point where I wanted to actually do the work. I didn't feel qualified to be assessing what other people were doing when I hadn't done it myself. So I switched over to banking for about 10 years. I was a relationship manager in the corporate world and then did commercial credit work. And then I decided to stay home with my kids for a while. And after several years of that, after I think it was about 7 years, I got a call from the OCC to come back. It was in 2007. They knew there was trouble on the horizon. They needed some people with experience to come help be field examiners. I think one point I like to make to people when I talk about my background is that I basically started over at the OCC. I had to come back, even though it was 17 years later, at the same level at which I had left, despite my other experiences. But at that point in my career, I was willing to do that. And I was confident that I would be able to regain lost ground. And I did. And after about 10 years there, was asked if I wanted to join the team at Ocean First as the Chief Risk Officer. So my story in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Grace. And again, thank you for being here. Next, we have Alex Feldman, who is a JD graduate and the risk specialist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Alex Feldman. It's a privilege to be here. I really love coming back and being able to talk to people from Drexel. I went K through JD, and the JD was Drexel, so I love to be able to really talk to anyone who feels like there's something that I could add. One small caveat before I begin, I'm asked to say that anything that I say tonight is my own opinion and doesn't express the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philly or the Federal Reserve System. So having said that, as I told you, I went K through JD, and similarly, I didn't have a firm grasp of what I wanted to do. I studied philosophy in undergrad, so obviously you go to law school. I decided that I came to Drexel thinking that I wanted to be a DA. I interned at the DA's office my first summer. It wasn't for me. Like, it just didn't hit right? The way that it just didn't, some things just don't mesh. My first semester of 2L, I took biz orgs, and all of a sudden it felt like a world open to me that I was just fascinated with in terms of financial regulation, numbers, business, and anything that I could get my hands on. So I joined the entrepreneurship clinic, or the entrepreneurship specialty at Drexel, and later participated in the entrepreneurship clinic. And after graduating in 2012, the jobs that I really wanted were in M&A or transaction-based lawyering and things like that, but they just weren't there for me. So I wound up working for a nonprofit doing credit underwriting and grant writing for a while for microfinance organizations. And I was I enjoyed that a lot, but I was still wanting to kind of work through a more legal career. And so I was working with a recruiter who asked how I felt about AML. AML stands for anti-money laundering. And this wound up being a job in HSBC's BSA department. BSA stands for the Bank Secrecy Act. So for those of you who are, for the uninitiated in the BSA, it is a series of regulations which require the banks to report on, to identify and report on potentially suspicious activity related to money laundering or other kind of terrorist financing or financial crimes. I didn't know any of this before I took the job, but they were looking for people who knew how to read and write analytically, because that's the end product of a suspicious activity report. And someone had the brilliant idea to start going after either lawyers or legally minded persons, because that's an easy population of people who know how to read and write analytically. So I performed well. I kind of rose quickly in an environment where merit was rewarded. And I ended my career with HSBC by serving on 2 secondments to HSBC Hong Kong and HSBC Bermuda. The reason I was there is at my time at HSBC US, we were undergoing an operational change to satisfy regulators and release us from a consent order. The model which we started to engage in that operation at HSBC was successful, and so they tried to export it to the other HSBCs around the world. After HSBC Bermuda, they were relocating my job from Delaware to Chicago, and I didn't want to move to Chicago, so I wound up taking a job with a consulting firm, BDO. My job there was to start by doing Bank Secrecy Act audits for smaller firms, but we were a financial consultancy. So anything that needed to be done, it was also my job to learn how to do it and then execute the job. A lot of what I did there expanded on the operational side of things to looking at more internal controls and kind of governance related work. And 2 years after that, I was just poking around online, and I was trying to find some friends, some jobs that I thought they would be well qualified for. I ran across the Federal Reserve website and found a job that I was reasonably well qualified for, and applied. And then a couple of months later, I wound up starting there. It was a journey to this position that I didn't know was going to happen, but as soon as I started at HSBC, I knew that I wanted some kind of regulator job. I just wasn't sure that it was actually going to wind up happening for me. So I'm pretty happy, although I couldn't have guessed where that was going to take me.
Thank you so much, Alec. Next, we have Lisa Detweiler, who is the Managing Director, General Counsel, and CCO at FS Investment Solutions.
Thanks for having me. Education-wise, I went to college at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts, and then went right to law school at the University of Pittsburgh. And in undergrad, I was an econ major. So when I got to law school, I focused on all things commercial. And while I was in law school, one of the jobs I had was working in the Mellon Bank legal department. By the time law school was over, they had offered me a job, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to stay in Pittsburgh. And so one of my mentors there said, "Why don't you work for a regulatory agency?" So I'm gonna continue the theme that you've heard here. I had offers at law firms. At the time, it was sort of unusual to go right from law school into a regulatory agency in DC, but I did. I went to the OCC, which you've heard about. I was a lawyer there right out of law school, and at the time, there was a banking crisis going on primarily in the western part of the United States and in Texas. And while there, I lived in Dallas, Texas for 6 months. A bunch of us did, helping out in the closing and selling of failed banks. I went from the OCC to the role of chief counsel at the Pennsylvania Department of Banking, where we regulated 5,000 different depository and other institutions, banks, thrifts, credit unions, licensed lenders. And that was a really interesting position as well. But I think if you talk to lawyers in my age group, it's unusual for someone to have spent the first 9 years of practicing on the regulatory side. After that, I went into private practice. I was a partner at the Schneider Harrison firm here in Philadelphia. While there, Glass-Steagall was repealed, which really sort of prompted me to think I need to learn more about the securities side of the business. And at the time that Glass-Steagall was repealed, nobody really knew how that would shake out. I think most people thought that most people thought that the securities firms would be the acquirers of the banks. And in fact, it really happened the other way. But I went in-house to a client that was a securities firm. They were a relatively new company specializing in separately managed accounts. We had 4 registered investment advisors, 2 broker dealers, and we grew from about 8 billion AUM to about 482 billion. And in the midst of all that, we were acquired by Bank of New York Mellon. And so I was there for a long time. And then about 6 years ago, went to FS Investments, which is an alternative asset manager here in Philadelphia. We have about 23 billion under management. And you know, I think while it may not be commonplace, the regulatory experience has informed everything I've done since then, and has been so valuable in terms of understanding what the regulators are looking for and being able to, you know, design a compliance program that meets those expectations, hopefully exceeds those expectations, but at least meets them. So that's my story.
Thank you so much, Lisa.
Sure.
And last but certainly not least is Kimberly Pepinella, who is a graduate of our MLS program and is a universal banker at Bryn Mawr Trust. Kimberly?
Hi, good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for having me tonight. So as Amanda said, I recently graduated this past May in regulatory compliance. And so I started at Bryn Mawr Trust my senior year at my undergrad, which was at Cabrini University. I studied political science, business, and finance, and then went right into full-time at Bryn Mawr Trust as a banker and full-time at Drexel. So Universal Banker I'm a Universal Banker 2, which is my operation day-to-day is to make sure the branch is in compliance with our policies, along with helping clients with their financial needs. I consider myself fairly new to my career path. I do find myself getting involved heavily with Bryn Mawr Trust and the different departments that they have. We have different committees that I find getting involved with is expanding my knowledge within compliance in the banking industry, which I knew younger I always wanted to be in. So it's definitely filling knowledge that you get firsthand working inside a bank. And then outside of work, I am also a board member at Reiner Conservancy. I'm currently their treasurer, and it's a nonprofit organization that works with the township to ensure that we're on a green path, which is something that holds special to me. So that's me.
Thank you so much, Kimberly.
Yeah.
So we have a very diverse group of panelists that have differences in the career path that they've taken in both the private sector and as regulators. So I think everyone joining today will get a good taste of what financial regulatory compliance where financial regulatory compliance can lead you. So one of the questions I want to start with is a typical day in the life. And how does regulation and compliance play a role in your day-to-day? So Alex, you want to take the lead here?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So my title is Risk Specialist within the Supervision, Regulation, and Credit Department. Of the 900 change people that work at the Philadelphia Fed, something like 300 of us work in SRC. I am a I perform bank examinations, and my risk specialty is the Bank Secrecy Act. That's what I'm charged to do, I guess, about half the time. What that means is I'm performing audits and bank exams of community banks and regional banks within the 3rd District to ensure that they are operating within compliance under the Bank Secrecy Act. The specifics there, starting an exam works way out ahead of time, where we look at the bank's profile, we determine what the size of it is, what the products they use, and from there we use kind of internal mechanisms to determine what the risk for the Bank Secrecy Act of that given institution is. From that risk, we then build a profile of the things we need to exam to ensure that the community bank is within compliance. Then we send out a list of things that we're asking for, we're getting them back, and then we start the exam properly, which is poking around in all of the different folds of the Bank Secrecy Act organization program within the organization. We perform testing to see whether or not the suspicious activity reports are useful and helpful, and that the bank is caching the suspicious activity that they should. We're working with the bank leaders to answer any questions, offer some best practices, and I've seen a lot of audits, so I'm in a unique position to be able to help those compliance program leaders shape a more effective compliance program. So about half of my time is doing that specifically for the Federal Reserve. I'd say another quarter of my time is spent doing other tasks that involve my specialty, but still within the Federal Reserve System. If a bank is anticipating joining the Federal Reserve System, we may have a Bank Secrecy Act review of them before they join to kind of know what we're getting into ahead of time. I'm also working with other regulators within the Federal Reserve System and other regulators generally to kind of make sure that we're all on the same page and that we're all looking at a bank with the same risk tolerance, the same practices. And going through those kinds of efforts is more laborious than you might think. And I guess the last quarter of my time is spent developing my own skill set and kind of expanding what I'm capable of doing. Most people who work for the Federal Reserve aren't one-trick ponies. And so as soon as I joined, there was an expectation that I would be able to contribute meaningfully soon, being able to perform exams for other functions. And so in the time that I've been with the Fed, I've now been able to expand to doing more internal audits and governance and some IT exams, and they're starting to break me into some of the more financial components of doing exams as well. In addition to all of this, there are other people who have Bank Secrecy Act questions as it relates to the 3rd District. So, other institutions may ask their own points of contact. They have a BSA question. And as serving as the subject matter expert, I'm usually the one who has to field those questions. So it's a lot of back and forth and making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page with regard to expectations while performing these bank exams.
How about Lisa? Take us through your day in the life and how regulation and compliance plays a role.
Yeah, I will say in my world, anyway, there is no typical day. So one day you may be focused on a litigation matter. The next day you may be focused on an HR matter. All the while you are monitoring the compliance program and testing the compliance program and documenting that. And so, and honestly, that's one of the things I love about what I do. Every day is different. And the variety of things that you are handling is extensive. You could be negotiating a contract. You could be working with the regulators. You could be in an exam. You could be preparing for an exam. So the range of interesting projects that come your way in this world is really extensive. And the other thing I'll say is another variable is the ongoing changes to regulations and the introduction of new laws and regulations, which then prompts changes to the compliance plan. Often the regulators will put out guidance, interpretive letters, and those have to be taken into account in your policies and procedures as well. And so that is, that adds another layer of investigation to the work.
Yeah, so being the current lead in my branch, I have to make sure that everything that we're doing is complying with the BSA regulations. If it's explaining about certain cash limit transactions that's happening with the clients, or making sure accounts that are being open are to policy, and making sure that everything that we're doing on the backside of our daily operations is to standard with the policy of the bank that is going further into the policy within the state and federal regulations. So it's a lot of double checking, not only my work, but the work of people who I work with in the branch, along with people who are in different departments who need second viewing of things when it has to do with the branch operations.
To describe my day, I want to go back a little bit and remind you, I mentioned that when I went to banking for about 10 years, it was largely in the credit world. So I had gone from the wide specialist of a generalist examiner. I was kind of specializing more and more in credit. And during that time, I took the Chartered Financial Analyst examinations and got that designation, all because I didn't want to be such a generalist, right? So that was very helpful when I was called by the OCC to come back at the verge of the financial crisis. They needed people who could help assess credit. But that passed over time. And as I rose up through the ranks, I had to get reacquainted with things like BSA, which had changed very much since the 80s when I had last done it. I was limited to filing currency transaction reports at that time. And there was a lot of problem bank supervisions, a lot of working with the attorneys like Lisa, which I enjoyed a great deal to learn more about how the law shapes what and how we do bank supervision. And I really enjoyed the combination of that legal aspect with the financial analysis of the credit work and the earnings and liquidity analysis. So for me, it's straddling two different components, the financial and the legal aspect. So now as the Chief Risk Officer, my responsibilities are, I'm responsible for compliance in all bank regulation across the bank. And I'm also responsible for understanding our current risk position across the bank and making sure that we have the enterprise risk management systems in place to stay on top of that, to identify, measure, monitor, and control those risks. As you know, I'm sure you've heard me say before, everybody who works for me knows way more about their area of responsibility than I do. That's where my background as a generalist comes in handy. And I think one of the things that I enjoyed about my regulatory experience was it is top down, it is big picture. You need to know the details, you need to know the particular rules and aspects of, say, BSA. But at the end of the day, you have to step back and be able to look at the whole picture and see the balance and where does this stand relative to all the other factors. And so that's a lot of what I do in my day is balance the various things and try to make sure we've identified the risk and we know what it is, but we can't spend $5 million to fix it necessarily. So reaching that balance is I enjoy applying that judgment.
So our next question for our panelists is about skills that are particularly important to their success in their areas of work. And I've also asked our panelists to provide any advice or recommendations to students who are looking for a career path or may already be in their area of work. So let's start off with Lisa.
I think, there are a number of skills in this area that I think can be really helpful. One is detail. It is really important that you like detail. As Grace just said, this is a key component, whether you're talking about the law in a financial institution, the compliance. It's really understanding exactly what happened in a transaction, exactly what testing you do and how you do it. I think another really important aspect is to understand the operation of the business. When I left my law firm and went in-house to the client, for a month, I would go in early in the morning and just shadow the operations team to understand how does the business actually get done. And it probably was one of the most valuable things I've ever done, because as you're applying the law or regulation to the business, it's very helpful to just have a very detailed understanding of how things actually work. And then advice to students. First I will say, if you're interested in this area, at some point in your career, you do want to think about having the experience of working in the regulator and being on the other side of the table. It's really interesting work, great people, and I think it really makes all the difference in the world. If you talk to folks who haven't worked for a regulator, and I'm always surprised during a regulatory exam, the fear that people have going into it, not because they've done anything wrong, but because they're not familiar with the process. And the ability to understand the process, have good relationships with all of your firm's regulators are just critically important.
Kimberly, especially graduating with the MLS, what skills are particularly important to you in your job, and anything that came from MLS that has helped you?
Yeah, well, banking law was one of my favorite courses. And like Lisa said, the relationship building is, I think, the most important skill, because I remember the first time we got internal audits. Now this is internal within the company. And I just froze. I had no idea what I was doing. But then over the time, over me working with Bryn Mawr Trust, being able to build a relationship, you just become and being more familiar with my job. It's just a second. You don't even think about it at that point. Another skill is definitely flexibility. I took my studies online for my master's, and now a lot of people with the pandemic working from home or taking online classes for the first time, or I know a few people within the company who had to leave the office and work from home, and they couldn't adjust, and unfortunately they left the company. Or I know some personal friends who took a year off of school because they couldn't be flexible with the change. And just as simple as getting everything online or being able to communicate online is an important skill, because you don't know what's going to happen in the future. And myself being client facing as well, working with clients who have no technology skills at all, or just not fully liking the idea of banking online, you have to be able to express the security with it, and ensuring that, of course, we're here to help and be flexible with them as well.
Well, I think that Lisa and Kimberly touched on some good ones. What Lisa said about wanting to understand how the business worked and ran and really operated. Is exactly why I went to banking after a few years of being a regulator. And I find that that really helped me. Taking the time to learn how a bank runs and being a banker for a while really helped me immeasurably when I went back to the OCC. It made me a much better examiner because I could apply judgment much better because I knew what was realistic to do, and I could then craft in my head, okay, well, this is the requirement per the law, but what's really realistic for them to do in practice? Because sometimes, it's hard to tell where that line is, right? So learning how to make those judgment calls for me took actually doing it. Maybe that's not what other people need, but I needed to go do it for a while. And I think something else that they touched on about understanding different points of view, it is amazing to me as well how little people understand where the regulators are coming from. And I'm sure my opinion, that view was informed by the fact that I was one for 15 years, but it's not that big of a deal. I mean, the law is the law. We all, follow the law every day. You just need to understand what it says and what the expectations are. And so being able to be whichever side you're on, being able to understand the other side's point of view, put yourself in their shoes. There's almost always the right middle ground can be reached. And I think that, just takes time and experience and to figure out how to do that. You get better and better at that over the time. It's something that I enjoy. So I'd say that's a skill, long-term that I would encourage people to develop so that their application of the law is, or the regulation is the most effective.
Yeah, I think there's two primary things that I'd want to leave the students with. The first is the importance of the ability to enjoy writing well. You're going to be around people who prefer working with numbers to words, but the challenging part is distilling complex thought processes into either a policy or something that requires being able to translate that concept for someone else to be able to pick up and read. And not a lot of people want to be able to do all of the writing that is required to memorialize the things that are being done well. So if you can establish yourself early on in your career as somebody who writes well and enjoys that, I think from a small bank, you'd wind up being the go-to guy to be able to write all the things, which gives you exposure to a lot of different concepts and allows you to learn more. And so it kind of creates this feedback loop. And if you're at a big institution, the ability to write well is just as important because you'll be around people who only want to do their job and then just kind of put their feet up. But the ability to translate what you do and kind of justify your value add in writing is going to be the most important because you'll have less visual exposure to other people and your words will be able to demonstrate how competent you are. So don't be afraid to flex the skill of writing well. And the other one that I would point towards is the ability to self-educate and not be intimidated by that fact. And I'll kind of talk about it in the same way. At a small institution, if you'll quickly find that you wear a lot of hats. I've never talked to somebody at a community bank that doesn't do multiple things multiple times a day. And you may be hired to do one thing, but the ability to quickly identify what the next task you have to accomplish is, learn how to do it, and then learn how to do it well will allow your career to kind of keep blossoming on itself. And I think the same thing is true in a large banking organization where you'll be a little bit more siloed initially. And the more that you can identify the intermoving parts of a large bank and how X relates to Y, relates to 1, relates to 2, will allow you to do the job that you were hired to do better, which will kind of further propel your career forward. So one, be comfortable and enjoy writing well. And 2, don't be afraid of and even encourage the self-educating on various topics.
That's great advice too, Alex. Thank you. So Throughout the discussion, we've heard a lot about continuing education and learning different aspects, different regulations and areas of work, and working on communication and relationship building. As part of that, we want to know any networking or career organizations that you've been engaged with that have helped support your career and career path.
I think there are definitely a number. I mean, one is on the legal side, the Bar Association, whether it's the Pennsylvania Bar or the Philadelphia Bar, it is a wonderful resource and a great way to network with other people who are doing the same types of things that you are. On the securities side of the house, there's a group in Philadelphia called the Philadelphia Compliance Roundtable. And so it's an open membership. Anybody who's in compliance at a securities firm, a publicly listed bank, it can be a member. It's a very robust group and something that you want to think about. There are national groups, the National Society of Compliance Professionals. Depending on what skill you're trying to develop or area you're trying to learn more about, all of these organizations can be extremely helpful. And then, generally on the networking side of things, there are wonderful organizations of all types in Philadelphia. I mean, I'm currently the president of the Forum of Executive Women here in Philadelphia, which is a group of 500 women, and many bankers, securities firm folks, and people from all different industries. But it is really important to focus on both in-industry networking and external networking. And it's really important because you can get really tied to your job and lose sight of, sort of the broader network that is available in the community.
I would encourage people to the twin ABAs, right? So we talked about the American Bar Association, but I think the American Bankers Association is probably just as important. And for my money, I'm going to say that you might have a better time networking with decision makers on the American bankers side of thing, because there are more decision makers on that side. So you're going to have a better luck trying to find someone who can probably do some good for you. And the other ones that I'll plug, at least for the BSA side of things, is that there's ACAMS, the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, and ACFCS, which is the Association of Certified Financial Crime Specialists. And if you just kind of poke around and Google those, there are some job boards and some networking associations. And I've gotten a number of interviews and some job offers just from randomly applying to some things that kind of looked interesting. Delaware is right down the road, and that hosts a whole lot of compliance departments and operations for banks.
Any tips for your younger self? If you could go back in time, what would you tell your younger self?
I as I've listened to the other panelists, I think Alex has given some really good advice about that. The attitude of continually learning and challenging yourself, and just being open to where it takes you. I think several of us have said, I kind of knew where I wanted to go. In my 20s, I was going to be the president of a bank someday, and that didn't quite work out, but I'm close. I talk to the president every day. I work very closely with them. I didn't really know how I was going to get there, if it was even feasible, but I just stayed open to opportunities. But one thing I think I would, if I could tell my younger self, is not to be afraid of making mistakes. I mentioned that when I went back to the OCC, I kind of had to start over. And I wasn't as young then. I was around 40, I guess. And that didn't bother me then. I don't think in my 20s I ever would have done something like that. It would have been embarrassing, or, you know, I've been self-conscious that what other people thought. I didn't care in my 40s. It was right for me and my family, and it worked out. It just, you know, the opportunities I got from doing that resulted in where I am today. So don't be afraid to take chances and make mistakes, or take a lateral move if you feel stalled in one direction and something else is piquing your interest. Just keep learning and keep trying things, and it kind of falls into place. You figure it out along the way.
I wish that I took a course in Excel, right? I studied philosophy in undergrad, and I basically had to self-teach myself everything that I was referring to, and even a little bit, and I know I touted self-teaching as great, yeah. But like, if you could just let someone give you some of the tools that you'll need to succeed, I think you'd be surprised how many people don't know how to use Excel that work in banking. And if you can be able to create that magic, you will be invaluable.
I think these are all great points. I think I would just encourage, I would encourage everybody to really focus on where their interest lies, and really not be tempted by other things that they may not be interested in, but really just to focus on those areas that they are really passionate about.
I think Alex said it best, is be prepared to wear multiple hats. I would never expect the more work that you would put on yourself, because you want that knowledge that your day-to-day activity won't necessarily give you unless you take advantage of the experience. So be prepared to wear hats and take as many experience as you possibly can while you're working towards your career.
So at this point, we're going to move into our Q&A for the last couple her squeeze a couple questions in here. Tina Ford, thank you for posting some questions here. First, her question is for Alex and any other panel member who would like to chime in. Tina has a similar background where she was an English Lit major, thought she was going into criminal defense, and found her true passion after taking bankruptcy and interning for the CFPB. She doesn't have any finance in her background, and most of the listings that she's seeing and looking for jobs require a finance background. Alex, you had mentioned applying for jobs that you were kind of qualified for. How do you handle those requiring finance experience? And secondly, ditto for an underwriting position, as she has an interest in mortgage work as well.
Sure, I'll kind of answer just in reverse because it's a little easier. The underwriting helps for a number of different ways, mostly to be able to communicate with the sales side of the business, to be able to understand how money gets made and where you're working. So like that kind of experience is kind of invaluable in that regard. And at least in my experience, if they say that you need to have a finance undergrad, I think that some kind of legal grad substitutes that away. While they're looking for, if you're looking for an entry-level job in a financial firm, they're looking to make sure that you have certain core competencies. And if you can discuss on your resume and include the keywords that get you past those algorithmic determinations, then just make sure that you actually do know those concepts, because if you get to an interview and they ask you about them and you don't have them, then that's the easiest way to kind of get not this follow-up interview. But if you look at the job posting and see exactly what they're looking for, use those words in your resume, and it'll get past the filter. And I think those kinds of base level resume building things are more important than actually knowing that you took finance in undergrad.
Let's see, any tips for exploring international jobs like Hsbc or Shinsei?
I'll just say that, I referenced earlier working for a securities firm here in the area. We were then acquired by Bank of New York Mellon. Bank of New York Mellon has offices globally. And one of the projects I worked on while there was to set up a mirror business, to the US business in Asia. So we were hiring Asian asset managers. We were meeting with the Hong Kong and the Singapore regulators and going back and forth. So I would say that, you know, there are a lot of institutions that have international business, and it's very interesting, and it's you know, all different regulations, and all different regulatory schemes. I've worked in projects in Europe, in South America, in Asia, in Central Europe, and it really is fascinating, you know, to understand our structure in the United States and then compare and contrast regulatory schemes in other locales. It's really fascinating.
Thank you all to everyone who's participated, our panelists. Thank you for your time today. As Audrey mentioned and I mentioned, I am a student ambassador. So if anyone in the MLS program has any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on our Drexel email. And just thank you all so much.